And I'd like to talk a little bit about each of the two speakers. It's an interesting method we're using today. But I'd like to tell you a reminiscence about the two of them more than biographies. I've known Bruce and Robert in many past lifetimes. And we've been probably in monasteries many times together. And Bruce is a world traveler who has taken many spiritual pilgrimages, and he's a leading light in our church here. In 1985, after a very large family gathering in Great Britain, a number of us ended up in Glastonbury, which is the British equivalent of the metaphysical city we live in, Virginia Beach. It's a very sacred place. King Arthur and the whole legend of Glastonbury is centered there. And this one dim evening, Bruce and I happened to end up on the grounds of the ruined abbey at Glastonbury. And we started palling around and just walking the grounds, and it was such a sense of having been there before, to the both of us. And with Bruce's shepherding of our church here, I really came to believe that he may have been one of the abbots at Glastonbury Abbey, because and we just really bonded and just walked around there just like we'd been there many times. Bruce is, as I said, a leading light in our church, and we owe him so much for having held this church together, as though he is our abbot. And for Robert, I'd like to say that I met Robert personally first when I moved out here in the early 80s, and I had known about him, and I was very much in admiration of him. I was sort of in awe of him. He had written a trilogy pulling together Edgar Casey's Sunday school teachings at First Presbyterian Church right up here on Pacific Avenue. And it was a chronicle of Edgar Casey's Sunday school teachings, which was really very admirable. It was a real benefit for people involved with Edgar Casey to read what he had to say about his interpretation of the Bible to his class, and still reach out to people who were not psychically involved particularly. And so Robert and I became good friends as a result of meeting through another mutual friend, and we have taken our own spiritual journeys together. Twice we went on trips with a group from Rotterdam, Netherlands, called David House. Robert was spending some time over there in the 1980s, and they came up with a plan to go to Israel. And there was a group of Americans and Dutch who got together, and we flew to Israel and visited probably most of the really sacred sites that were there. And Robert was one of the leaders of that group, and every place we went, we meditated. It was one of the most fascinating places to me was that we stayed on Mount Carmel in a monastery of Catholic priests and brothers, and that's the mount where Elijah founded the School of the Prophets. And so we meditated in a grove of trees there, and every place we went, we had a meditation. We were hoping to bring peace and harmony between the two warring factions in Israel. The strange thing is, after we got back from there, was when what's called the Intifada started. Now, I don't know what God's plan is for this, but that is what started causing all of the really heavy-duty rift that we are still experiencing today when we look at Israel and how those two brothers, half-brothers, cannot get together. Because, as you know, the Arab and Muslims there were founded by the son, one of the sons of Abraham. And the Jews also looked to Father Abraham. So it's very interesting that these two half-brothers, Ishmael and Isaac, their descendants have been at war with each other ever since. And really it all had to do with Abraham disobeying God. Anyway, we tried to do what we could, but maybe we brought a certain energy which will eventually bring peace. We don't know. The other trip that Robert and I went together on from David House was to the south of France to visit what's called Cathar country in the Languedoc there. The Cathars were a Christian sect of Gnostics who lived very ascetic lives, and they counted men and women as equal. Men and women could reach the highest levels of their religious persuasion, understanding, and the Catholic Church took them as a great threat, so they wiped them out, literally. And so we went there and visited all these wonderful sacred sites where the Cathars lived and taught, and had their students live in caves which were shielded from the vibrations of the rest of the world so that they could be purified. And it was a marvelous, marvelous trip and adventure that we took together there. And so these two people have been very dear to me as spiritual brothers, and I think many of us feel and know the beauty of these two people. So I'm very pleased to introduce both of them today, and Bruce will lead off with his half of the presentation, and then we'll blend right into Robert's. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Let's see. So we're doing this talk very differently today. We're both sharing it as has been explained. And the way this came about was last night about 5 o'clock, Robert called me and said, Bruce, do you mind helping me with this talk? And so I had to scramble. Of course, I was glad to. And the way we decided to format this talk is that I'm going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes on the life and the times of George Fox and what his beliefs were, what he gave to the Quaker Church. Then Robert's going to talk, the second half of the talk, about his experiences as a Quaker. And so I'm going to time myself to make sure I don't take any of Robert's time from him. You know, brothers, have this conflict sometimes. So, as you know, I always like to start my talks by just having a few moments of silence, in which I'll ask each of you to pray for Robert and I, that God will use each of us and to say the words that you most need to hear today. So if we could just be silent for a few moments. Thank you, Lord. Okay. So, George Fox. The only thing I knew about George Fox, who in here has ever heard of George Fox? Raise your hands. Okay, gosh, I'm surprised. George Fox was the founder of the Quaker Church. And the only thing I knew about him was two things: that he was the founder of the Quaker Church, and number two, that he was a big influence on William Penn, who was with his title, William Penn's title was proprietor of Pennsylvania. And he had a big influence, and to the extent that William Penn became a Quaker himself, and then that took hold. Quakerism took hold in Pennsylvania, as most of you may know. Had a big effect. You know, Philadelphia is known as the city of brotherly love, and it goes back to George Fox and William Penn. George Fox was born in July of 1624. This is the 17th century in England. This was a time in which there was a lot of wars, a lot of social unrest, and a lot of questioning of religion. It was in England at this time that different religions, like the Methodists and the Baptists and so forth, they were all having movements. It was a time of major change and great resistance to this movement by each other. He was born the son of a Lancastershire weaver, so born into very humble circumstances. And when he was growing up, he could hear this voice within him talking to him, giving him guidance as to answers to his questions. And he wrote that when I came to be 11 years of age, I knew pureness and righteousness, for while I was a child, I was taught how to walk to be kept pure. The Lord taught me to be faithful in all things and to act faithfully in two ways. First, to talk inwardly with God and outwardly towards man. And so this whole idea of going within, you see, and listening to this voice within was was not the norm in that time. As a matter of fact, it was considered radical to the point of being blasphemous. But that was his great teaching. And when he went through his middle, late adolescence, early 20s, he was like a lot of us. He was searching for meaning to life, trying to figure out, what's my life all about? What's all this about, you know? And he, of course, turned to his spiritual mentors, the priest of the churches, the Church of England, asking them, tell me, you know, help me with this. I hear this voice, my inner voice guidance tells me this, and the church says this, help me. And he says they gave him no help at all. He said he went to one priest in Warwickshire, and that priest, after hearing his problem, says, I tell you what, just take tobacco and read the Psalms, and you'll be fine. And he didn't like tobacco. And then he went to Coventry, another priest he was spilling his heart to, and he stepped on by accident on a flower in the priest's gardens, and the priest had a temper tantrum. He had that anger thing that we were talking about earlier in the service. And the third priest said, I tell you what you need to do is practice bloodletting, and you'll be fine. So he got completely turned off to the priesthood. He said, I can imagine him thinking, these guys are all nuts, you know. And but what he found the answers to was in the Bible. He read the Bible. He found it to be extremely inspirational. He felt that he met through reading the Bible, praying and meditating, he could feel Jesus within his heart. And it was Jesus that then became his teacher, according to his writings and his teachings. So what were some of his beliefs then? That he had these beliefs were formulated before he started preaching, but one of his beliefs was that we don't really need a priest for the reasons that I just gave. He says anyone can be a priest. The qualification for the ministry is given by the Holy Spirit, he taught, not by ecclesiastical study. That implies that anyone has the right to minister, assuming the Spirit guides them, including women and children. This was a very radical idea at that time. Later in his life, he wrote that Abel, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and David were all shepherds. None had gone to seminary. And he used them as examples to support his case. Church buildings, he says, God dwells in the hearts of his obedient people. Religious experience is not confined to a church building. This was a radical idea, because at that time, if you did not go to church, you could go to jail. They actually had laws. You know, even in colonial Williamsburg, you know, they have, it was fast. That's a great place to learn about colonial history. But and if you did not go to church here, you could be arrested and be put in the jail. Fox says, well, you can just as soon worship in fields and orchards, believing that God's presence could be felt anywhere. The Bible. He got his greatest inspiration was from the Bible, and he used the Bible to support his views, but he taught that the idea is you read the Bible, you then pray and meditate upon what you've read, and you ask God to give you guidance as to what it meant. See, this was totally different than the conservative Christians who says, well, it has to be all interpreted literally. So all these things later on got him into a lot of trouble with the authorities, and he was in prison over and over and over again throughout his life because of these beliefs. And he didn't start sharing these beliefs till he's 23 years of age, and he started at that time, for the first time, preaching in public. And at first, of course, there's a few people who listened, but the crowd started to build. And at one point, he was preaching up to 1,000 people would be listening to him. They said, yeah, this is what we've been looking for. He reminds me a little bit of St. Francis of Assisi. This is what St. Francis did. He says, we want to go back to primitive Christianity, the basic teachings, the simplicity, where it's just God and myself. God is my personal Savior. My God is there for me. As opposed to the church teachings, which were that you had to go through the church. You had to go through a priest. The priest had to interpret the Bible. You don't interpret it. You know, you're not really able to do that. That was the teachings of the church. He says, no, you need to do this yourself. Another big problem that got him into trouble was his belief that against war, his refusal to take up arms. This was a big problem at that time because, and also the other problem was his refusal to take oaths. You know, Jesus says, take no oaths, swear not, say yea or nay, but do not take oaths. And he took that literally. But there was a big problem with the authorities because the government at that time, which Oliver Cromwell was they called him the Lord Protector of England, not the king, but the Lord Protector. That was his title. For you history buffs out there, you may remember that Oliver Cromwell overthrew the King of England, Charles I, had him publicly beheaded, and he took over. And he was very much of a Puritan in terms of his religious beliefs, very fundamental, very conservative Christian. But this, during the early part of his life, up to Oliver Cromwell died around 1856, I believe it was. And it was 1860 that Charles II, his forces, the monarchists, so to speak, they came back to power, and Oliver Cromwell's whole government fell apart. So he had two different kings that he was basically working under. One, you know, Oliver Cromwell and Charles II, but they all were fearful of him because when he taught his people not to take up arms and refused to take oaths. They both wanted him to take up an oath of allegiance to the government. You don't do that, you go to jail. I refuse. They want you to take up arms to protect the government from the other side. He refused to do that, you go to jail. And so this happened over and over again. He talked about the inner light. He said, you listen within. Guess what our church is called? The Fellowship of the Inner Light. Everything he taught, basically is exactly what we teach here and what we believe in. And he says that, you know, you go and you listen to this inner light. And this was, in the Church of England at that time, this was considered blasphemous. Guess what? Blasphemy was against the law. Guess what? Once you could be arrested for this. So this was another reason he got tossed, and not just him, but all his followers would just get tossed into jail. And jail at that time was brutal, and there was torture involved at times. And his followers went through a lot. And keep my eye on this watch here. And at one point he appeared before a judge, and he looked the judge eyeball to eyeball. He says, "Tremble at the word of the Lord." And the judge looked back and says, he mocked him and said, "Ha ha ha! You tremble at the word of the Lord. I'm going to call you a Quaker. You people quake at the word of the Lord." Well, that's where the word Quaker came from. Isn't that interesting? He did, of course, the judge wasn't meaning to give it that name, but that name took hold. Let's see here. So basically what happened then, the rest of his life, he was out helping to teach these teachings all over the world. When he was not in prison, he'd get out and start doing it again. He was truly a saint, you know. He didn't care about imprisonment. And thousands of people in England, in 1770, he went to the New World and spent 2 years over here preaching in all the colonies. And over here he was still had a lot of resistance in some places, but like I said, in Pennsylvania, thank goodness William Penn was very impressed with him. And so impressed, he decided to become a Quaker himself. So that was a wonderful thing, because this was the one place you could talk about being a Quaker without worrying about going to jail. And my favorite William Penn and George Fox story was that William Penn goes up to George Fox one day and says, "Brother, I understand the teachings about nonviolence, and in my heart I feel you're right, but it's always been my custom as an authority, it's the custom of everyone in my position of authority to carry a sword with them." He says, "I cannot put my sword down." And he says, "I don't feel right about it, but I just can't do it." And so, you know what George Fox told him? I love this. He says, "Carry thy sword till thou canst no longer carry it." A couple of years later, he put his sword down. He wasn't ready, you see, at that point. But he kept growing spiritually, and when at a certain point, he was ready. So there was great wisdom in that teaching. And so he came back to England after 2 years in the colonies, and he had periods of severe depression because he saw his followers being locked up. He'd be locked up, and it was very depressing. You know, he felt sorry for all the people that he was leading, that they had to go through this. But then he pulled himself out of those dark nights of the soul, and it made him closer to God. He died in January of 1691 at the age of 66, having left behind this wonderful church that we call the Quaker Church. So I have now talked for 13 minutes and 40 seconds, and I'm going to turn this over to Robert.
What I say is Bruce is a template of a spiritual being. This is what I want to be in my next life, is more like Bruce. He's helpful, he's kind, he's generous, patient, all kinds of things. I just
smart.
Do what?
He's smart.
He's smart too, yeah. Smart. Anyway, so Bruce has pretty well covered the life of George Fox, as much as I know. Because what I know of George Fox is the inner experience. When I assume everybody here knows about Edgar Casey. And when I came down from Michigan to Virginia Beach, pursuing a woman who became my wife and then former wife, but she led me to Virginia Beach, and that's where I discovered Edgar Casey. And everybody knows about Edgar Casey? Do I have to explain a little bit about him? No? Okay. So Edgar could go into his own silence and get in touch with his inner resources and tap into the universe and pull down information that was holistic. And he could do healing at a distance, not the laying on of hands type, but he could diagnose illness from people who were thousands of miles away, and it turned out to be accurate. But mostly it was a holistic type of healing, remedies that he was given. And I was fortunate to meet and have as a spiritual, I call her my spiritual mother, Gladys Davis Turner, who was Edgar Casey's secretary for 42 years. And they lived on 17th Street across from the school. And so I started visiting with Gladys and her husband Al. And Al Turner talked about three things: Edgar Casey, spiritual life, and the Quakers. He talked about the Quakers constantly, and that was new for me. So he talked so much, and Gladys lived across the street from the Catholic school, and I was raised Catholic. But I got intrigued by what he was saying about Quakers and sitting in the silence and getting answers. So I decided I was drawn to go and explore about Quakerism, or as it's formally known, Religious Society of Friends, being a friend of God and a friend of one another. So their approach had to do a lot with silence. And I grew to love that approach. You would go to Quaker meeting and sit in the silence, and that was the service. And but the teaching was, if you had something came to you out of the silence, you stood up and you spoke it. And like a true Quaker, you didn't come with a prepared speech. You didn't come with something you were going to say. It had to arise out of the silence, out of your meditation. And if you felt like George Fox, a little voice within urging you to stand up and speak it, you did. And then you sat down. That was it. And I fell in love with that. It spoke to my condition, as we say. In the first meeting there, I sat in the silence and I got up and I spoke. Something came to me to speak. And sat down. And Louise Wilson, I don't know if anybody here knows who Louise Wilson is or was. She's since gone on. But she was the founder of the Quaker meeting and also the Friends School, which is one of the beautiful schools in Virginia Beach. So she was a very authentic person, very spiritual and deep and quiet, calm but profound. So after the first meeting, after I had stood up and spoke out of the Spirit and sat down, then Louise stood up and added to the message. It was beautiful. It was so profound. And she came up after the meeting and spoke about that what I said had inspired her with that message, to give that message. And that was awesome for me. This was, so for 13 years, I went to Quaker meeting, and we had this relationship, Louise and I. She would speak, and I would then speak from her speaking, or I would speak, and she would add to what I said and deepen it and beauty. And it was the beauty of Quakerism, or being a friend. But the teaching then was the silence, this respect for the silence and what happens in the silence when you open yourself to it with no preconceived ideas as to what you want to do or say, but let something nudge you in that direction it would be like unfolding. You're unfolding yourself through this process. It's beautiful. So I had great respect for that process, great respect for Gladys and all the people of those early years. Then people started from this church, started coming to my house, or where I was living, to tell me that I should really try and come here. This would be a good place. And Paul Solomon was alive there, and head of the church, and a little bit resistant to come, because I didn't think anything could surpass my own experience here. But eventually I said, enough people came up to the house to tell me that I should look into it. And I had, actually I'll tell you, I had a little problem with Paul Solomon, because I thought he was pretending to be Edgar Casey. my love was deep for Edgar. But then the more I got exposed to Paul, the deeper I had feelings for his wisdom that came through him. And so that was my experience, and that was my orientation toward what Virginia Beach means to anybody who comes. This experience where the spirit is held in respect and honesty, and communities come. And there are days that before they started working on the street here, this place would be full. And then they made it hard to get here, but that meant the ones who were mostly connecting to what they received here continued to come. And so it is to this day. How are we doing with time? Where's the clock?
Give it back. 5 minutes, Robert.
5 minutes. Okay. Everything you hear, you read about God in the Bible and from commentaries and so on, you yourself are capable of that. Not capable, you're encouraged to sit in the silence, and when you sit in the silence, you learn about God. You learn about God because you create a desire to apply, because it's your own teaching. It's come through you, not through somebody else. So you start getting nudged in certain directions, and then you are to put that into practice in your life, whether it arises out of your own intuition or whatnot, and you grow in spirit. And as you grow in spirit, it becomes an authentic spiritual experience of your own. And you can't be shaken. People can't talk you out of it, tell you that can't be, and so on. Your family, your husband or wife or whatever, if they don't agree with what you're receiving, that can't be shaken because it's your own experience. And that's how God wants to. And God isn't a person. God is an energy that is available to all of us, and we all have a similar experience to this creative energy or force that goes around the globe and out into the universe and so on and so on. It's one God. We're a portion of that God. And it's a living God. That's what I like. It's not something you read about or happen to somebody else, but it's happening to you. And the more you apply what your intuition guides you, it won't guide you into anything like violence or crazy stuff, but it's the unfolding. You start to unfold layers and layers of yourself, because Edgar Casey said this, and other teachers and so on. Our first creation was not as Adam and Eve, but as a spiritual being in a spiritual world. And we did the one thing we were not supposed to do, or maybe we were supposed to, but we didn't live in harmony with spiritual values and rules. We started to explore with our own personal choice and create experiences for ourselves that brought us into the flesh body, evolved, and we became flesh beings. But we were first spiritual beings. And that knowledge inside us is there. It's covered up. covered over because we've made our physical experiences the dominant kind of force in our awareness and what we're seeking in the earth and so on, riches and fame and sex, cars, movies, all this partakes of the world. But to sit in the silence and reach the spiritual source within yourself that speaks to you, we have to learn how to believe it, because the ego, which we've created out of our physical experiences, our spiritual experiences, our physical experiences, have become the dominant consciousness in our body. And it doesn't want to die. The ego doesn't want to die. So it resists, and you have to really struggle at times, many times. It's sort of a matter of course. It is the struggle to give the spirit, make the superior leadings that occur from within ourselves the dominant force or awareness we trust and apply. But because the ego is so embedded into the physical part of ourselves, that's the classic battle, is to return dominance back to the spiritual part of ourselves. So we're so blessed to have the fellowship of the inner light to help feed the aspect of the spiritual part of ourselves, and listen to members of the church as they share their experiences, helps the spiritual awareness of ourselves become more and more trustworthy, that we put our trust in it, our faith in it, and then we return. And the wonderful thing is, the more you give dominance or have faith in this inner self of yourself, you start to have wonderful things happen. Like you don't get sick anymore. You don't get afraid anymore. You don't... You grow in spirit, and spirit was from the beginning and will be forever. So we get more and more in touch with us, with the part of us, we say the God within. And if we really think about what does that mean? A portion of the God within is me. And God always was, always will be, creative, so on. So that's me, and that's you, that's all of us. And here in the fellowship, is the wonderful thing is you find people who are like-minded, and it becomes more out in the world, it's more mental and beliefs and rules and rituals, etc., etc. So I've just loved the fellowship of the inner light. It has been a great source of guidance and health, prosperity. And the prosperity, when I say that, I mean it's the richness of the spirit, making that real for you, not just something you speak or read about, but it becomes your own life. How's that?
That's great. Awesome.